So hello, everyone. I hope that you found the way through the new link that we unfortunately had to set up this morning. And I think, yeah, we have quite a number of people now. We can start the session if you're all ready. Okay. So thank you for joining this first Decoso meeting. And maybe shortly to introduce this Decoso term that we constantly use, it stands for Decolonizing Socialism and Entangled Internationalism, the research study group that is led by Doreen Mende and also including Vinit Agarwal and me as a PhD researcher. And the title of the session is Decolonizing Socialism and Kai, basically Cybernetics. We're very happy to be able to welcome our guests, Professor C.K. Raju from India, Ramon Amaro from, I think, somewhere in Great Britain, and Aarti Sunder joining, I think, from Massachusetts. I think with that we can start, and I'll hand over to Vinit Agarwal.
Thanks, Leah. I'll just start. We want to acknowledge that Horticulture de Art Design had in Geneva, a location and institution that hosts the project Decoso, has in past benefited from triangular slave trade and unfoldings of colonial loot that informed its material epistemes and laid its founding conditions. We acknowledge the fact that HAD continues to collaborate with foundations such as Hans Wüstorf, Hand Bank, amongst others, who inherit the wealth from slave trade. Capitalism. We hope that students and alumni, along with research staff, continue the struggle for abolition of this inside, outside, and on the peripheries of this institution. And then I'll hand over to Doreen.
Thank you, Vinit. Thank you, Leah. We also wish to acknowledge the continuity of the history of violence, extraction, and slavery under the conditions of racial global platform capitalism, enabling the operational mode of platforms such as Zoom, which we share right now are implicated in. We wish to recognize the labor, the experiences, the struggles, and the knowledge of those who have been subject to the political violence and epistemic censorship of Zoom itself. And we wish to think of those people who are with us in this moment, but invisibilized and silenced, the people who are workers working on e-waste sites in Ghana or in India right now, and or who are suffering most from the ecological crimes in the name of... I think, Mika, you have your mic still on, just maybe...
Нет, но я вернусь, я поеду и вернусь. Понимаешь?
No problem. This is part also of the Zoom infrastructure. Mikael? Ah, merci. Okay, I just repeat this please once more. We wish to think of those people who are with us in this moment, but invisibilized and silenced, the people who are workers working on e-waste sites in Ghana or in India right now, or who are suffering most from the ecological crimes, the coloniality of infrastructure and imperial modernity until this present moment, even worse at this moment of the pandemic planetary crisis. I also would like to welcome Ghalas Charara, who has been working with students today, Lorelei, Mikael, Phoebe, Basile, Balam, Matthias, Lorelei, and Garance this morning already in the seminar room of the CCC, offline and online via the infrastructures of the platform. And I would like to continue to just share a few sentences that we share with Vinit and Leah together about the Decoso framework, The Decoso Meeting is a series of the transdisciplinary study Decolonizing Socialism, Entangled Internationalism that is funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. The case-based studies spark academic and para-academic methodologies in order to mobilize specific practices, specific historic practices in the field of the arts, architecture, technology, and cybernetics from former socialist or geographies of Eastern Europe, always in entanglement with actors, agents, and partners in Africa, Asia, and or Latin America. Our specific focus are cybernetics in an expanded sense in the context of a world communist politics or socialist internationalism between 1949 and 1990 in the conflicting conditions of the global Cold War. Not as a historic archival find alone, but as a trajectory to problematize technopolitics such as planetary computation as proposed by Benjamin Brereton, or planetary automation, as Luciana Parisi has proposed us to think within this present moment. Committed to study the micro-political engagements, we aim to move below or beyond the macro-political narrative that the Cold War's binarism imposed by means of unearthing the potentialities of art and technology towards a communist world making that aimed to create societies across borders, yet united by anti-imperialist politics, as Angela Yvonne Davis suggested, or an anticipatory politics, as the curator and researcher Marion von Osten suggested. We consider art research, experimental forms of research, as highly necessary in such a transdisciplinary, transnational investigation towards decolonial times.
The Decoso Meeting that Doreen just talked about now is a seminar-like series that seeks to discuss cybernetic practices and aesthetics for probing the epistemological condition and historical legacy of cybernetic thinking that underpin contemporary concerns about big tech and the rise of digital feudalism. The first Decoso Meeting that takes place today, Decolonizing Socialism by Cybernetics, will address in particular the intersection of decolonization and decoloniality in relation to calculus and mathematics. The question to focus here is how and in what way do we situate mathematics and algorithms in relation to socialism and socialist internationalism? In this context, it remains pertinent to understand socialism both as a political project of modernity or not, and as a philosophy of world making to fight imperialism, colonialism, and fascism.
And for us, it is important that this workshop-like series really offers a space to get into a discussion about concepts. And therefore, we would like to also continue this series and further invite scholars and artists to offer a theoretical proposition, about which we can then delve into a discussion, and also what Ghalas Charara is doing with the students today, then transcribe these sessions to also basically create and collect terms and the relations between different concepts and terms to build up a conceptual map as part of the Decolonizing Socialism research project. So we hope that after the session, we can also share this visual documentation with you that might give other insights than the spoken talks can give. And Ghalas, would you like to shortly say a little bit about your practice?
Yes, thank you. I was disconnected from the other computer. So I'm Ghalas. I'm a former CCC student, artist and researcher, and we spent the morning trying to think of ways to bypass or rethink speech-to-text transcription, and especially in the context of this digital moment. So maybe I'll tell you more about it in the end when with the students we'll have experimented with the tools we came up with.
Thank you, Ghalas. Before we will enter the conversations, but also with the great honor and pleasure expecting the proposition by Professor Raju, we would like to share a few set of questions that we have been thinking with and also sharing with the participants, Professor Raju, Dr. Amaro, and Aarti Sunder. And that also you received in the dossier. We hope that the dossier has been helpful. It has contained a few links also to the texts by Professor Raju on his very elaborate website. Professor Raju has been working on the concern for decolonizing mathematics and the coloniality also of science for decades from a theoretical and practical perspective. We will introduce our speakers also in a moment, but allow us to share this set of questions with you, something that keeps resonating also surely beyond this work meeting. How do we articulate the geographic and historical specificity of the processes of decolonization, socialist thinking, and cybernetic practices? How to displace cybernetic practices from their Eurocentric inertia in socialist practices, and how to think of coloniality both in vector to European imperialism as an incomplete exercise that continues and to inform a neo-colonization as the phenomenon that functions through similar mechanisms as cybernetic practices. How can we think of cybernetics in relation to internationalism and feminist internationalism in particular? Where do these two practices coincide, intersect, and depart?
And I will continue. At which point does the material constitution and construction of technology in cybernetics become contingent on race, extraction of material resources, ecocides, and exploitation of human resources? How to think of a socialist vision of cybernetics that accounts for the violence of its technology production? How to question the racial fabric of various cybernetic and algorithmic practices, such as artificial intelligence? Which kinds of contemporary cybernetics are decolonial and or socialist? Do they exist? What are contemporary mutations of cybernetics? If computation depends on a logic of norm or a law of calculus that defines the infrastructural conditions under which computation takes place, then what could be possible methodologies or practices to problematize this logic in regard to class and the role of state today?
Thanks, Leah. I'll continue. How can artistic research methods shape programming languages, algorithmic processes, and the aesthetics of application of cybernetics? How can artistic research methods develop into cybernetics of the future? Then what are the examples for the intersection of cybernetic logics with decolonial logics in the context of a global socialist modernity? What happens to cybernetics when socialist modernity partakes into globalization? What are the differential factors of cost that will question its socialist paradigm? Taking from the work and practice of Abiba Birhani, how do they materialize in master plans, infrastructure, and housing? What visual cultures do these interactions produce? And finally, how do we deal with the problem of scale, taking from the work of Matthew Marcoli, from a position of practice that is informed by the search or the urgency for decolonial technopolitics?
And now lastly, we would like to do some housekeeping regarding Zoom before we start the session. I think we're all quite accustomed to this technology by now, but still it would be really helpful if you could mute yourself during the proposition by Siki Raju and also the respondents, and post your questions in the chat, so then we can draw from them later on in the more open discussion part. And also, please then in the open discussion, feel free to unmute yourself or raise a hand or post just question for Aarti Sunder, and then we can ask you to unmute yourself and say your question in person. And then we would like to ask you for permission to record the session. If you do not agree, please write us a message so that we can later on see that you will not be seen in the recording, in the video. And now shortly the agenda. So we will start soon with a proposition by Professor C.K. Raju. Afterwards, we will have a short break to digest and think. And then there will be the conversational responses by Aarti Sunder and Dr. Ramon Amaro. And then later on this open discussion part, Ghalas will then offer a small intervention together with the students. And we hopefully can conclude by 3:30. But as Professor C.K. Raju also already suggested, we'll see how the discussion goes. And now we would like to introduce our guests. I'd like to start with Aarti Sunder. Aarti is an artist and researcher who's interested in ideas that create the subject, the infrastructure of technology, economy, and experience, how we relate to these ideas and how they make us. She uses video performance, writing, and drawings as tools for her research and practice, and she graduated from the Dutch Art Institute. She was a fellow at Ashkal Alvan's Home Workspace program, at Art Dubai as well, and she was resident artist at Alt Sakal in 2019, as well as member of the Sommer Academy Paul Klee lately. Aarti is currently enrolled at MIT program in Art, Culture, and Technology, and we hope that there's enough time also that you can speak a little bit about your current project on ghost work, the opaque form of labor for online platforms.
I have the honor to introduce Dr. Ramon Amaro. Dr. Ramon Amaro is a lecturer in Arts and Visual Cultures of the Global South, Department of History of Art, UCL. Dr. Ramon Amaro's writing, research, and practice emerge at the intersections of Black study, psychopathology, digital culture, and the critique of computation reason. Dr. Ramon Amaro draws on Frantz Fanon's theory of sociogenic alienation to problematize the delocalization of the Black psyche in contemporary computational systems, such as machine learning and artificial intelligence. Dr. Ramon Amaro's research pulls away from the notions of psychic negation as set forth by the Fanonian model of representation to investigate alternative models of relation between race and technology. Dr. Ramon Amaro's ultimate aim is to develop new methodologies for the study of race and digital culture. Dr. Ramon Amaro completed his PhD in philosophy at Goldsmiths while holding a master's degree in sociological research from the University of Essex and a B engineering in mechanical engineering from the University of Michigan and Ann Arbor. Dr. Ramon Amaro has worked as an assistant editor for the Sage Open Access Journal, Big Data and Society, Quality Design Engineer at General Motors, and Programs Manager for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, ASME.
Hi, thank you for the introduction.
Okay, yes. Leah, would you mind to, I can also introduce Ghalas and Professor Raju, which I do with utmost pleasure. We also really would like to introduce Ghalas also within some notes. The artist researcher Ghalas Charara will rehearse with the students Balam Simon, Basile Collet, Garance Bona, Lorelei Regame, Matthias Paulus, Phoebe, Lynn Elnan, and Yasmin Imre, if Yasmin can join still. A transcription of the work session from an artistic perspective, how to transcribe, record, trace, and make palpable, yet remain under cover of the absences of languages, sonic glitches, corrupted transmission, transcodings, human non-semantic enunciations, the R's and O's and sighs and silences and cracks and failures that move below the faculties of communicative capitalism, as Jody Dean proposed to theorize the era we are living in. And last but not least at all, and I have to look for my paper, it is an utmost pleasure and a profound honor to introduce Professor C.K. Raju, who joins us from India at this moment. Aarti joins us from MIT, so it's really early now for Aarti and pretty late for Professor Raju. I have had the pleasure and the privilege to listen to Sika Raju's elaborations on decolonizing mathematics last year in August in a session organized by Reni Gabri, Irina Nastas, and Jessica Kapadia, testing assemblings, which is a very fascinating series of events and conversations organized by the 16 Beaver Group from New York around across different continents on the question of the cartographies of struggles and what we as artists, curators, researchers can do. And Professor Raju's session was mind-blowing and really fascinating, so thank you for this. And Professor Sika Raju, I hope we continue this conversation now in this context, is a computer scientist, a mathematician, and an educator, a physicist, and polymath researcher. Professor Raju received the Telesio Galilea Academy Award in 2010 for defining a product of Schwarz distributions, for proposing an interpretation of quantum mechanics dubbed the structured time interpretation and a model of physical time evolution. And also for proposing the use of functional differential equations in physics. Professor Raju also has experience from a practice by being a key contributor to the first Indian supercomputer, the Param, that has been developed in 1988-91. And also Professor Raju has done considerable historical research, most notably claiming I don't know how to pronounce this, infinitesimal calculus. I tried to rehearse it. I rehearsed it many times. The infinitesimal calculus that was transmitted to Europe from India. Professor Raju has authored 12 books and dozens of articles, mainly on the subjects of physics, mathematics, and the history and the philosophy of science. And you can trace the comprehensive and proliferate kind of oeuvre of Professor Raju on his website. We will send around the link also of everyone that is contributing. Please use the chat also to share with pleasure. I think that is great. And dear Professor Raju, I would like to hand over now the screen and the floor and time and the energies to you. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you everyone for joining in. And it will be a pleasure looking forward to hear your propositions and followed up with conversation responses. Thank you so much. If there are no questions so far, we continue with Professor Raju. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And as you know, I have some personal cybernetic issues after a stroke. My hand doesn't work. And so I can't type. I have to use dictation software. And then when I say affluent society, affluent people, it types affluent with an E. So you have those kinds of jokes which help what is happening. But anyway, there may be various kinds of errors, so never mind about that. Now, I would like to share the screen and get started. Now, I love to talk with artists, and I really love it. But sometimes the things that you say are extremely complicated, very hard for me to understand. I am a simple scientist and so on. You know, we do very simple things. And sometimes this complexity is very difficult, but I try to understand it. Okay, so I would like to share my screen. Are you able to see this? Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I want to talk about what is the matter? Why doesn't it work? Okay, so I want to start with 3 questions. What is the decolonization of mathematics? How is it relevant to socialism? And what does it have to do with technology? especially of cybernetics and artificial intelligence. Now, I think the most of the time is going to be spent in trying to explain what is decolonization of mathematics. It is not in proportion to importance, but it is because it is little hard to explain. Because people wrongly believe that mathematics is universal, and they want to know what is colonial about 1 + 1 = 2. And I have answered this number of times, and I will just repeat those answers here. And the key question in colonial mathematics is not that 1 + 1 = 2, but why 1 + 1 = 2. So why is 1 + 1 = 2? So most people repeat what they were taught, as children: 1 orange and 1 orange make 2 oranges. But this involves an empirical process. You can see the oranges in question. And that is okay in normal mathematics, but not okay in formal mathematics. And formal mathematics is the mathematics that colonialism brought. I also call it Western ethno-mathematics. So the point is, it is divorced, if you like, I should pronounce it the way my speech recognition software does. It is divorced from the empirical. Empirical processes are not allowed in formal mathematics. And that's the mathematics brought by by colonial education. Why? Because formal mathematics demands axiomatic proof. Okay, so what is an axiomatic proof? An axiomatic proof is a sequence of statements in which each statement is either an axiom. An axiom is the same thing as postulate, is the same thing as assumption. Or the statement is derived from preceding statements by means of some rule of reasoning. That's the formal definition of a formal proof. And the rule of reasoning could be something as simple as what is called modus ponens: A implies B, therefore B. But the point is that an axiomatic proof excludes facts. At no stage can I say, I see this, therefore it is true. I see those oranges, therefore it is true that 1 + 1 is 2. So the exclusion of the empirical means it is divorced from the empirical and axiomatic proof. Now, what does an axiomatic proof look like? I think I have shown this, but if you have seen this, never mind, see it again. It is worth saying. This is Russell's axiomatic proof of 1 + 1 = 2 in 378 pages. Do you see any oranges here or any apples here? Nothing of the sort, right? Nothing which you can recognize. This is what a formal proof is like. You just go on writing a sequence of statements. All right, let's get rid of that. No mention. And now, what do I want to do? I want to, somebody mentioned calculus, right? Because science requires calculus, and calculus supposedly requires real numbers, which are taught from class 9 onwards. So what I want is the axiomatic proof, not just a 1 + 1 = 2 in cardinals as Bertrand Russell did, but in real numbers. And that is much more difficult. So that is my Cape Town challenge, which I tried out with the mathematician there, but I tried it out again. I offered a prize of 1 million for an axiomatic proof of 1 + 1 = 2 in real numbers. And there is a video of this lecture that you can take a look, just take a look at, well, if it's taking too long, I'll never mind. This lecture was held in JNU, and I offered this as a challenge to the faculty, and nobody accepted it. I offered them 1 week's time to the reduced price. And the same thing happened in MIT. There's also a talk that I gave at MIT, and I asked the people there whether they knew about real numbers, because I was talking about calculus, and they denied the knowledge. Said, we are not confident. They're smart enough to deny it, but that's okay. What I want to say is that 1 + 1 = 2 is hardly a trivial thing, because it requires knowledge of axiomatic set theory, one as a real number. And that is something very few people have. Okay, never mind. What I want to say is that this divorce from the empirical means it is metaphysics, not mere abstraction. People say mathematics is abstract, but that's not the problem. Nobody has a problem with dogs. You can teach a child what a dog is. And a dog is an abstraction, so many shapes, sizes, colors, and so on. But you can point, here is a dog, and the child understands. You don't have to define a dog. You don't have to say a dog has 4 legs and 1 tail and so on. And not only do children understand, they also understand the difference between a dog and a cat. A cat also has 4 legs and a tail and so on. So they find metaphysics difficult because they cannot acquire knowledge of their own, such as the difference between dog and a cat. Nobody teaches it. I'm sure nobody teaches it, but people learn, children learn on their own. So abstraction is not the problem. Problem is this is all metaphysics because it is divorced from facts. And the axioms are also metaphysics. So for example, Hilbert's axiom in his geometry is that there is a unique straight line through 2 geometric points. This is not a fact. If I take 2 dots, then I can connect them in more than one way by lines. So it's not a fact. Now, what do people do in school texts? They will try to dodge the fact. And they will say, let's make the geometric point invisible, so small until it becomes invisible, then you will get one line. But an invisible point is metaphysics because it does not exist in reality. No, you cannot point, you cannot give an ostensive definition of an invisible point. So they say point determines the location. Here are 2 chaps fighting. Where is the point? And they can keep fighting because there is no way to see.
What is this? What is this?
Some issue. So the metaphysics of set theory is needed to define the real number 1. And it is a very complicated metaphysics of infinity, which very few people, very few mathematicians also understand. So it has no practical value. So an axiomatic proof does not add any practical value to any application of mathematics. People think, it must be doing that. And I think the grocery shop example was given. Let me show you the cartoon again. You take that 378-page proof. It does not add anything to the value of 1 + 1 = 2 in a grocery shop. All right, it does not add, and you have lived all your life without knowing or feeling the need for an axiomatic proof of 1 + 1 = 2. How did you lose? So all practical value comes from normal mathematics. And if you are in a grocery shop, you need to relate numbers to objects which you can see. But there is this, it works superstition. There is this great fear. If you change things, then something will happen. Something will happen in high technology, maybe it's rocket technology, maybe it's cybernetics and so on. It's a completely superstitious fear. Okay? Because the colonized mind is terrified of challenging the master. It says it works, but what works? They don't know. So how do you calculate rocket trajectories? You calculate by solving differential equations. How does NASA do it? Differential equations require calculus. And calculus we teach in our schools and colleges requires real numbers. But how does NASA calculate, or how does ESA calculate the rocket trajectories? It does so on computers. But a computer cannot represent a real number because it is unreal. Computer cannot handle unreal things. The human mind can. Imagine that it can handle it, but a computer cannot do it. So they work with floating point numbers. And those floating point numbers are quite different from real numbers. They don't obey even the same algebraic rules. Associative law for addition fails. This is a very old paper, 20 years old. Maybe you can look at it. It's on the alternative epistemology of the calculus in the Yukti Bhasha. It's in Philosophy East and West. Okay, it's a very old paper. Maybe you just take a look at it. I won't go into that just now. Take my word. Maybe we can go into the discussion. So formal math does not work. All right. Other examples, Pythagorean theorem. Now, Pythagorean theorem does not work. Where is it true? It's not exactly true anywhere in the world. See, if you do it on the curved earth, it's not true. And because it's not true, so many Britishers lost their lives because of bad navigation. They thought it's a mathematical theorem. It must be true. It's not. Why is it not? Because the surface of the earth is curved and the triangles that you draw are different. All right. And it's not true in space. Don't imagine you can go through the earth because space-time is also curved. So it is not true for triangles anywhere in the world. It's not exactly true. And the same way, there's some mention of calculus of variations. So the big problem of calculus of variations is that you look at a cycloid. Now, what's a cycloid? A cycloid is a curve like that. if you have a stone struck in a cycle, which is moving with a constant speed, then the stone will trace a cycloid. That's the red curve is the cycloid. So it is what is called the brachistochrone. This was a big problem that was solved by calculus of variations long time ago.
C'est Raju, on dit qu'il y a le mathématicien qui est en train de parler. Enfin bref, il est hyper chaud, mais il est à fond dans son truc.
I'm sorry. Brachistochrone, but the problem is I tried to explain this brachistochrone to my son, and I took him to a model, but the thing is it does not work, because with a brachistochrone, if you take I mean, there's a model of that set up in Delhi, and it does not actually work, because it is not equal times regardless of amplitude. And so he wrote, eventually he performed experiments and wrote a paper on it. And this paper is in physics education. So you can take a look at long back. How do you solve? Because in the real world, you have resistance, and the solution of the brachistochrone problem with calculus of variations doesn't work. All right, although this is used everywhere in physics, it doesn't work. All right. And if approximations are okay, why do all this complexities of formal math? You have a function space, and you'll have a distance and function space and variations and so on and so forth. So it's all hypocrisy. The practical value comes from normal math, not formal math, whether it is groceries or rockets or artificial intelligence or machine learning. What you do in practice is normal math. What is talked about or taught is formal math. Now I teach calculus, decolonized calculus without real numbers. I use non-Archimedean arithmetic. Real numbers are Archimedean. Okay, but let me not go into those technical details. You're artists, so let me talk of aesthetic value of mathematics. There is a Western myth that math is beautiful. Okay, doesn't matter if it has no practical value, it is beautiful, right? And Plato put mathematics on par with music as a way to arouse the soul. It was, I mean, the Egyptian mystery geometry which Plato used had some aesthetics. I don't deny that. But formal math or colonial math, which we teach today, has no connection to the soul or its arousal. In fact, the church cursed that pagan notion of soul. The Christian Emperor Justinian and the Fifth Ecumenical Council cursed that notion of soul, and he shut down all schools of philosophy. It's well known. And the mathematician Hypatia was raped and brutally killed in a church for advocating this notion of soul. I'll come back to her. So formal mathematics is supposedly based on Euclid. Euclid is a text which was used by the church. And since the church had cursed that Plato's notion of soul, it could not link to that notion. So formal mathematics no longer connects to the soul or to soul arousal. It is soulless. And that soullessness makes it ugly, like Russell's proof of 1 + 1 = 2, extremely ugly. And most of you have experienced it. Most of you probably avoided mathematics just because you were repelled by it. But you thought it was a personal failing. It's not a personal failing. It's a problem with formal mathematics that is taught. So most of you probably like music. Maybe you did not take lessons in it, but you liked it. So a disconnect has developed between mathematics and music since Plato. And I too left formal mathematics for the same reason, because it is ugly metaphysics of no practical value. So now the question is, if it has no practical value, no aesthetic value, what value does it have? So it has political value. Political value is for whom? For the church. It had great political value for the crusading church to talk about mathematics as metaphysics. Why? Because the church constructed a theology of reason during the Crusades. It wanted to do that. It wanted to adopt, because to contest the Islamic theology of reason or the Akli Kalam. But it could not adopt normal reason. Everywhere in the world, people use reasoning, but that's normal reasoning, which is reason plus facts. Why? Because facts go against church dogmas. And therefore, the church made a striking innovation. It invented formal reasoning or metaphysical reasoning minus facts. And this allowed Aquinas to reason about angels. No? So Aquinas is reasoning here. This is Summa Theologica, whether several angels can be at the same time in one place. All right, now how does he reason about it? because angels, there are no facts about angels. So all you have is a fantasy. And based on a fantasy about angels, he will then say so many angels are dancing on the head of a pin. And this is, I mean, this is what Aquinas did. I gave you the original source, so you can take a look at it. It is fantasy reasoning because it is devoid of facts. But this church innovation is Marxist because it innovated, it worked with metaphysical reasoning. It is hidden behind several layers of masks. All right, so let's come to the epistemic value that is claimed. The key Western claim is that axiomatic proof is superior at epistemic value. All right, and decolonization of math is about attacking that. Central proposition is that the claim that prohibiting facts results in superior epistemic value is complete bunkum, even if everybody in the West has believed it for centuries. It is complete bunkum. And it is not just complete bunkum, it is a church superstition, and that is why it is so widely believed. So the fact that it is widely believed is of no consequence. So that colonial claim of epistemic superiority is used as part of a claim of civilizational superiority. All right? That only the West understood the superior epistemic value. Everybody else was an idiot, the Maya, the Indians, the Egyptians, and this is what our textbook in India states at class 9 level. Nobody understood. Only the Greeks understood about metaphysical reasoning and metaphysical math. So this claim of civilizational superiority is very similar to racism. So the claim of racist superiority bogus, that whites are superior to non-whites. And so also colonialism involves a bogus claim of civilizational superiority, that the West is superior to the non-West, especially in mathematics and science. So this relation of racism to colonialism is organic. It is not just a casual analogy that I'm making, because they are supported by the same false history. That claim of superiority is supported by false history. And this history was concocted by the church during the Crusades and the Age of Discovery. It's a false history of science. And during the Crusades, a whole lot of Arabic texts were captured or imported into Europe, including the text of Euclid in 1125. And this knowledge was indiscriminately attributed to early Greeks. What is Euclid? Perhaps just a subtitle of the book, Key to Geometry. So then the second part of the concoction was that during the so-called Age of Discovery, so we know what happened in the Age of Discovery. You know, there was this doctrine of Christian discovery. I have an article on that. You can see what the position of the US Supreme Court is on that. So you have, there is a reference to the US Supreme Court here. So take a look at it, because this was accepted. They seized all the lands. So North America, South America, Australia, the original inhabitants are all dead or gone. So this was used to seize land, but it was also used to seize knowledge, to appropriate knowledge. This part is not known. That indigenous knowledge was appropriated on the same doctrine by claiming it was discovered by Christians. For example, the calculus. Calculus existed in India from the 5th century, but it was taken from India, and then you say Newton discovered it, or Leibniz discovered it. They did not even understand it. So please take a look at these articles on Marx and mathematics. I'll come back to that. So point is, we are not just talking about false history in terms of credits. False history results in bad philosophy. So a concern is not with correction of credits, but how this appropriation of knowledge resulted in the promotion of a bad philosophy, as in the bad philosophy of geometry attributed to Euclid, but actually due to the church, or the bad philosophy of the calculus attributed to Newton. So why is that philosophy bad? I've discussed it in great detail. What are Newton's fluxions? It is there in my book, but here is also an article which you can easily access. Now, what is this business about opposing colonialism? Just as anti-racism seeks to uproot the claim of racist superiority, and it may involve toppling racist titans, as in the roads must fall, agitation. So also decolonization seeks to uproot the claim of civilizational superiority. and it involves toppling civilizational icons. And that could be, so these are already toppled, as you can see. This is Newton, and this is Euclid, and this is Copernicus, and this is Ptolemy. And so the idea is that you topple them, but they need to be toppled because they are false icons. They are false gods of science. So Euclid must fall. Of course, there is no evidence for the existence of Euclid. There is counter evidence that the book was written by a black woman from Africa. And I told the artist that I want this woman with fire in her eyes. So he had the fire of the great library of Alexandria in the background. She was the daughter of Theon, who was the last librarian of the Library of Alexandria, which was burned down. So this is Hypatia in the 4th century, not a white male from Greece in the -3rd century. So you can also see the details. This is not just a random statement that I'm making. All the details are there in this item. Was Euclid a black woman? You can take a look at that. But the point is, most important point is that there are no axiomatic proofs in the Elements. The Elements is a book on Egyptian mystery geometry, which Plato talked about. It does not have any axiomatic proof of any proposition. For 700 years, this nonsense has been taught. The book is there, but nobody reads the book. Please read it. There is not a single axiomatic proof in it. It's just a totally false claim. Look at the first proposition. So the first proposition is, you are given a line segment and you draw these two arcs and they intersect, and then you join that point to this and join this point to this. But how do you know these two arcs intersect? You see them intersecting. That's an empirical proof, not an axiomatic proof. There is no axiom in the book Elements from which this intersection can be deduced. Now, not only is there no axiomatic proof, this has been admitted. I mean, it is really the height of gullibility that from 1125 to 1900 CE, all Western scholars, they read the book and they foolishly believed the propaganda that it's a book about axiomatic proofs. It suited the church. In 1878, Dedekind attempted real number. Attempted. He did not construct real number. That's a story. He attempted because to construct it, he needed set theory, which came in the 20th century. Okay, so you can find that article also. I think I just cited it, so never mind. He attempted real numbers. But more importantly, Russell, he called the proofs in Euclid a tissue of nonsense. So this is his article on the teaching of Euclid. The 4th proposition is a tissue of nonsense. That's what Russell called it. He understood that there are no axiomatic proofs in the Elements. And this is not the only person. Hilbert wrote a whole book. That's the starting point of formal mathematics, Foundations of Geometry. This book is also on my website. You can take a look at it. The translated version, of course, not the original German version, but it's available on the website. So you can take a look at it. It's from Project Gutenberg, Foundations of Geometry. And he supplied, why did he write? Because there are no axiomatic proofs in the actual book, and he wanted to supply those missing axiomatic proofs. So the problem is, even when these facts have been publicly exposed for 100 years, the claim of Euclid's non-existent axiomatic proof still persists. Okay, Euclid did not exist, but the book does. Okay, we did not read the book. Okay, it has been exposed, but it has axiomatic proof because that is vital to the claim of civilizational superiority. And it is there. process, or you must blindly rely on authority. Somebody said it is valid, therefore it is valid. So that's the usual process. So reliance on authority is not infallible by any chance. So deductive proofs are actually more fallible than empirical proofs. Let me give a concrete example. Chess is a game of pure deduction. If you play without a mistake, it must end in draw. But every grandmaster, including the world champion, will make a mistake in every time he plays the game, and therefore will lose every time to the computer. May make a random draw once in a while, very rarely, he'll be very lucky. So it's a foolish superstition that deductive proofs are infallible. All right. So formal, but what it does is it has political value. It forces reliance on authority. First of all, you don't know, so you have to have faith. And then the metaphysics of it is decided by Western authority. Real numbers are decided by, because that is how it developed in Europe. And I teach something else, that it can be taught with non-Archimedean arithmetic, but I am not the authority. You have to really believe Western authority. That's the point of having formal mathematics. So the subordination to Western authority greatly suits colonialism. So that's what I want to say about decolonizing mathematics, that colonial mathematics advocates axiomatic mathematics. It uses a false myth that Euclid gave or intended to give such proofs, and the superstition that such proofs are infallible. And decolonization of mathematics is to put down these myths and claim of superiority. All right. And the infallibility of deduction. Okay. So there is also this issue of, I'll come back to that, two-valued logic is assumed in mathematics. But logic is not culturally universal. Buddhist logic and Jain logic are not two-valued, like Nyaya logic, which is available in India, which is like Aristotelian logic. Nor is logic empirically certain. There is quantum logic, which is quasi-truth functional like Buddhist logic. So how do you decide logic? Proofs and theorems could vary with logic. So logic can be decided either by a cultural dictatorship or it can be decided empirically. Either way, deductive proofs can never be more certain than empirical proofs. The logic itself is decided like that. So demand is to replace formal mathematics by normal mathematics. So we reject formal church math and its myths and superstitions and replace it with normal math. Now let me quickly say a couple of words about colonial education. Macaulay sold colonial education in India using the myth of civilizational superiority. He spoke of the immeasurable superiority of the West in science. No one checked the false history he used for 2 centuries. And therefore, he said the colonized needed Western education for science. But that same Macaulay, in British Parliament, he advocated education as the best means for counter-revolution. So this is the link to his speeches of Lord Macaulay, and I've given the date and you can look it up, on 18 April. So shortly before the Communist Manifesto, because what does the Communist Manifesto starts with the idea that a specter is haunting Europe. And what Macaulay did was he wanted to exorcise that specter. He was an aristocrat, he was a lord. And he suggested that education is the best and cheapest means to contain revolts. Because Western education then was 100% church education, which taught subordination to authority. So now let me come to socialism. Contrary to Marx's prediction that, it is the most developed, where the productive forces are most developed, that a revolution will take place, it took place in the societies which were poorest, like Russia, and least educated. And after the revolution, these countries came under tremendous military and economic pressure. And the only way forward for them was rapid economic and military development. So the irony is that for that, they required a large scientifically trained workforce. So the post-revolutionary societies decided to accept Western colonial education, which Macaulay had characterized as the best means, as the best counter-revolutionary measure. So they were forced to do that. And specifically for math teaching, they accepted formal mathematics with its metaphysics of infinity, which is intertwined with church dogmas of eternity. And I have an article on that, if you like, eternity and infinity, how these are intertwined. But I cannot go into that right now. So For example, calculus is done with formal real numbers, limits and so on. It's still done like that in Soviet Union, Russia, China. Statistics is done with Kolmogorov probability as measure, which involves metaphysics of infinity. The measure is countably additive. So they should have reflected at least on Marx's own experience with calculus. Marx came before Dedekind, before Russell, before Hilbert, before the exposure of Euclid, okay, before the public exposure of Euclid, and before real numbers and limits. And he rejected Newton's confused calculus, because at that time, what was there? No real number, there were fluxions. Fluxions were based on the incredibly confused idea that Newton had that time itself flows. Why is it incredibly confused? Because it is an idea which is rejected as confused by an 8th century Indian philosopher, Sri Harsh, for common sense reasons, which are today known as McTaggart's paradox. It is discussed in my book on time. Won't go into that. Basically, if time flows, then there must be some time in which it should flow and so on. So Marx rejected the calculus of Newton and Leibniz as mystical, meaning confused. He was not really objecting to mysticism. He was objecting to the confusion. He did not understand what are these fluxions. But the point is that practical applications of calculus to Newtonian physics, to planetary motion and ballistics had already been achieved by the time of Marx. So real numbers were not needed for that, for any practical application. So they're completely irrelevant, but they are taught as absolutely essential today, right? Because Newton had achieved whatever thing he wanted to achieve before that. So the point is that using Western or church education for science subverted values, because Western education came along with myths and superstitions, as in the accompanying false myth of Euclid and his purported axiomatic proofs, or in the superstition that axiomatic proofs are epistemologically superior and so on. Hence, you must get the axioms from the West, real numbers, not non-Archimedean arithmetic as I'm talking about. So this induces a state of mental subjugation. And this happened with scientists in post-revolutionary societies, subjugating them mentally. And this, it's not a capitalist value system that we are talking about, but a strongly colonial value system to which was imposed, which is totally contrary to the idea of socialism, which socialist societies could not continue. It's not consistent with those values. See, even a one powerful individual like Gorbachev, and you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. China, of course, survived and prospered, right? But did socialism survive and prosper in China? It is a little controversial. I won't go into it. Let's look at the Cultural Revolution. Now, Stalin liquidated the affluent sections of the pre-revolutionary society, the kulaks and so on. Mao tried to co-opt them. He did not want that violence. He co-opted them, but he failed. And because he failed, this resulted in his Cultural Revolution. Now, the acceptance of the rhetoric of civilizational superiority, Mao accepted it and so did Deng. So Mao said 4 olds. Okay, those 4 olds included old culture and so on. And Deng with his 4 news, 4 modernizations. They both accepted the propaganda of civilizational superiority, that to get science, you must get this modernity, you must get all this stuff that the West does, and you must imitate it. So they failed to understand the counter-revolutionary danger to value systems, and which is posed by Western church education for science. Now, even Z has understood the importance of older values today, but they all fail to understand the possibility that this older philosophy may be relevant to modern mathematics, science, and technology. So I use zeroism, which is Buddhist Shunyavad, to teach calculus without limits. That's the decolonized calculus, which makes calculus easy. And also it makes statistics easy. And statistics is what is needed for machine learning. And most people don't understand it. I mean, I'm surprised. They just use Google TensorFlow for machine learning without understanding the underlying statistics. And if you don't understand it, it can lead to all sorts of problems like my dictation program. It makes errors. And tomorrow, if you're relying on it, it can make a huge error. So you need robustness. And so to have that, you at least need that people should understand what kinds of program they are making, because the failure of AI programs could be completely catastrophic tomorrow. But AI also involves hardware. It's not just about software. And of course, the software is out of control because it's not, you are not doing programming, because it's machine learning. Machine is learning on its own. And tomorrow's hardware will be quantum computers, which are based on quantum logic, which is different from two-valued logic assumed in formal math, but very similar to Buddhist logic of Chatushkoti. Why? Because that Buddhist logic allows A and not A at the same time. Schrodinger's cat is alive and dead at one instant of time, A and not A, which is not possible in two-valued logic, because from A and not A, you could deduce any conclusion you like. So today's science is still influenced by church dogmas, such as Aquinas' dogma of eternal laws of nature, which is already busted by quantum mechanics. It's not law-like behavior. No, God seems to be playing dice. But there is no room for human creativity. As artists, creativity is very important, but science has no room for it. And that is very sad. But future quantum computers will be Android. An android in the sense of part living plus part machine. And it would be impossible to control because it has a living part which you cannot dominate, unlike software, whatever kind. You just can't control because it will have its own objectives, its own desires, what it wants to do. And it will be much smarter. And nor can you control it with these old church techniques of using myths and superstitions to control human beings. So I think this is something that needs to be thought about. At least you need to understand it. But important thing I would like to repeat is that for socialism to work, math and science education must be decolonized by eliminating church myths and superstitions in current mathematics and science. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I overshot my time. Okay, let me try to stop sharing the screen. Okay, yeah. How much time did I take? I'm sorry. Okay.
Thanks, Professor Raju. Very inspiring. And I'm sure we have a lot of questions, discussions, and responses coming in. I just want to check the weather a bit. Shall we take the immediate questions now, or should we take a very short break and then we get into the responses afterwards?
Like, can take a short break for 5 minutes. You can think about it, and then we can start their questions. But
yeah, that sounds great. So
maybe we can take a break after they finish, perhaps, or we can do it now. I don't mind either way. We can take it now. No problem. Let's take a break now.
Great. So, okay, perfect. So I propose that we take a very short break, a 5 to 10 minutes break, and then let's be back here in 10 minutes time. Thanks, everyone.
Maybe 2:15 in this time zone. Thank you so much, Professor Raju. Thank you.
Okay, I think most of us are back here. So thanks everyone for sticking with us. And I guess now is the time when I would directly invite Dr. Ramon Amaro and Aarti Sunder for their conversational responses and a collective response towards Professor Raju's proposition.
Great, thank you. I would like to default to Dr. Sunder. If you'd like to go first, or
yeah, sure. I mean, I must first admit that I know very little mathematics. Sort of dropped it in when I was, I think, 16. But I mean, I would maybe be interested in looking at it through my own practice and what I'm thinking of. So I sort of I'm looking at it in 3 fairly large departure points. So one is how do we look at what is invisible and visible, how we look at what is real, and how much faith plays a part in both of these conceptions. So in terms of how I am maybe approaching it is the enormous labor and the enormous amount of material labor that goes into maintaining, say, smooth functioning of it works in terms of whether it's platforms, whether it's algorithms, whether it's any form of internet-based cyberspaces. There's an enormous amount of labor that goes into maintaining this as smooth functioning spaces. And I suppose my interest is double. So is to look at it with a great amount of geographic specificity, but to also simultaneously look at it as something which is far more fluid than only a certain kind of specificity. So I suppose counterintuitively it is to ask if a certain cultural specificity can actually be looked at as universal, and what would that take? So I mean it. I'm saying this with respect to, for instance, if I don't know if you had a chance to take a look at some of the links, but how the kind of extremely specific work that goes into determining how, like I was saying, like how certain platforms function, or how algorithms that are supposed to be finished are actually not finished, that require human intervention at very, very key moments where you think there is a lot of automation, but there's actually it's not to say there is no, but it is a very calibrated automation. And the kind of labor that goes into it is based on a particular understanding of culture, politics, history, and which is why it makes it so important to understand that there is a great amount of preconceived understandings of history that goes into maintaining these things. And I'm just wondering is it even possible in that sense, if there is so much of, it's so integrated, it's so networked, it's so universal in that sense, if it's possible to constantly be aware of the fact that there is a great amount of cultural specificity that goes into maintaining these things. And what would it take to look at the East and the West, the North and the South as slightly more fluid in terms of these, in terms of at least the it works paradigm?
I think, that idea of this type of fluidity, for me is quite interesting, and thinking about the continued problematic between that which is visible and invisible, and that which takes priority within the tension between either of those. And I think a project, such as this, requires a kind of return to the necessity for a type of visibility or invisibility, because that, of course, that has been a ontological type of inquiry for hundreds of years now, which we still haven't resolved, and that sense of being and that importance, as Professor Raju was saying, of that relationship between that which is comprehensible as a tangible object, that which becomes abstract, and that which becomes, is purely metaphysical. I mean, in a way, that delineation itself has defined our entire conception of Western thought, not to mention the epistemic relationship that we have to those thoughts. And we seem to keep returning to this question about this relationship and the necessity for this relationship. And, perhaps we take it for granted in thinking about what it means to be fundamentally organized by that which is seen and known and seemingly comprehended, and that which is more fluid more infused and almost parasitic with the, metaphysical types of relationships, and in a way, when we're thinking about the terms of art and design, we also sort of take that for granted because that becomes the prescribed mode of interaction, right? It's understood that the artist and the maker has a metaphysical relationship to that, which then gets articulated as a form or gets articulated as something that's tangible. And then we immediately recognize that that object itself only contains a portion of that entire metaphysical relationship, which is why us in the history of art, we're obsessed with thinking about modern, we're thinking about artistic motivation and historicity around it, so on and so forth. But there's an implicit paradox that we can enter into one paradigm of a type of cultural praxis that accepts that as a reality, and then that can coexist with other paradigms and epistemic functions that have, as Professor Raju was saying, an implicit resistance to understanding that that's also the part of the negotiation that we have in certain functions, and we say here sort of mathematics. And I think that your comment about not knowing much about mathematics, and I think is quite profound. And what I found in my own research and why I actually have an interest in mathematics is it seems to be somewhat similar to Professor Raju, is when we think about the conception of most symbolic mathematical functions, they were conceived by individuals who also didn't understand mathematics. These emerged out of ideas and thinking about the relationship between the person and the world, looking at this fantasy of a natural environment, looking at pattern types of relationships, and then infusing that with a certain subjective type of aim, and thinking about how the human relationship might mirror those types of processes, and then proposing that through a mathematical proof. And I won't stretch as far as to say that, early mathematics in whatever context was treated more like an art form, right? I think this is where Plato is making that sort of association, but it mirrors that type of concept. So if we think of someone like Laplace, who's looking at the certainty of the sun rising and falling, I mean, he started as basically looking at the sky, looking at old, navigational types of data, looking at the trajectories, these early sort of cybernetic processes. And then of course, at some random moment, of course, I'm reducing him by saying it's random, but at some random moment, then he thought, wait a minute, I wonder if human behavior can repeat itself with certain certainty. I wonder if this process can be formalized into an object that then could become its own sort of, gain its own sort of reason in replicating this type of process. And then of course that gets tested out in a very loose mathematical form, which is, as Professor Raju was saying, is just becomes formalized and naturalized almost as if it's the sun itself. And then of course becomes unquestioned, and it becomes something that in a way...
Dans le système de sécurité sociale, la Suisse, c'est celle qui a le système moyenâgeux. Ouais. Ah ouais. On n'a qu'un système privé d'assurance. Ouais. Mais ouais.
Okay. Okay, thanks. And in a way, it becomes something that gives a type of divinity, in itself. So I think, in thinking about the terms of that type of specificity, I would be curious, Dr. Sunder, just, quick question. I have some questions for Professor Raju, but I think immediately while we're talking about this, I'm just wondering, given my thoughts on that type of relationship, how you would then think about the production of the aesthetic within this lens, when you're saying then this importance of thinking about what is visible and invisible, and then also thinking about the fluidity of these sort of cultural specificities, I'm wondering how that comes into your work. Is it a necessity that it be grounded either in those categorical comparatives of visibility or invisibility, or does it also dictate another categorical imperative of a fluidity in itself? You see what I'm saying? Because it seems like a contradiction that we live in the world. I think there's an inherent desire. I'm not going to speak on the colonial context, because there's a desire for the opposite. But it seems like, especially within contemporary aesthetics, there's a desire to break down those barriers of the categorical and and participate within a mode of being that can allow the articulation of one's understanding of the world to materialize in an object, what we call the art object. But at the same time, it seems to rely on, that understanding seems to rely on the same categories in which it's trying to breach.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, because at some level, I think it's extremely counterintuitive to try to, at some level, escape these categories, but also understand that a lot of how things are organized, like you were saying, fall under these fairly, how do you say, it's not just ingrained, it's sort of set binaries. And I think a lot of it is predicated on the fact that it has been this way for so long. So then, in order to say tell different stories, or to make it's not just reveal, it's like, what are you revealing? And therefore there's an interest in trying to create counter myths, or counter stories, or counter epistemologies, in order to not just to say, okay, we have to correct this, but we have to tell a whole different story at some level. And that, I think, is something which is, it's a gigantic task. It's huge, and it doesn't have to have complete fidelity to these processes. I mean, you can make up stuff. It's fine to make up stuff, I think, and that's where I suppose it gets interesting. That's where you have the ability to go past these categories of visible, invisible, real, unreal, and maybe reconceptualize faith as something which is outlandish or something. I mean, which is not predicated, which is, I mean, it does have a particular historical process, but is there a way to how do you make it ahistorical, but with a great level of empathy at some level, and maybe that's it's a difficult task, but I think it's worth it at some level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, for me, that's very interesting about, you know, this ahistorical, because I think in a sense I wanted to talk about time, and ask Professor Raju as well about you know, the thoughts on time, and thinking about, you know, this process of bypassing this type of conjecture between, you know, these sort of epistemic processes of mathematics and even sort of and colonial reason, and the type of recurrent praxis of these, you know, and almost blindness to this type of colonial reason that then reinforces the symbolic mathematics itself. I mean, if we look at the architectures of colonialism in general, I mean, most of them and their descendants must be, you know, clapping every Thursday and congratulations, because they've tied the bow pretty neatly to reinforce their own logics through the epistemic process, which then becomes invisible. But in this case, you know, I want to think about how, you know, this relationship between, you know, space and time in particular, and these conditions of this sort of fictive Euclidean geometry or geometric frameworks, you know, are not only, you know, as you're saying, infused within the cultural milieu to the extent where it is a naturalized process like the sun or air. But I'm also trying to think about, and perhaps familiar, I mean, perhaps similar to, you know, let's say someone like Denise Ferrar de Silva, who, you know, is trying to think about, you know, and it's not just de Silva, it's a lot of the feminist materialists, you know, to try to think about how we can actually make a world that doesn't try to revise time per se, but that can think outside of time, because that time, in recognition that these structures of time and space are already owned by colonialism. And, you know, in a way we get trapped back in a Hegelian dialectic and trying to gain ownership and recognition that there's a certain revision of time that would be necessary. You know, in a way, I give more credit to colonialism, and perhaps I'm a bit too pragmatic in asking Western structures for recognition of that which they actively tried to propose in the first place. I'm quite pragmatic in thinking that the motivation and the capability for such violence and atrocity does not condition one for an empathy, even hundreds of years later, to then insert into their thinking a type of revision in itself, right? Because it benefits them. It benefits them not to have a revision. It actually benefits them to even have ownership of the revision itself. And so in a way, I see that representation of trying to revise something in that sense to be a sort of nihilist project in itself, right? Because we know that particularly Western colonialism will always draw it back into a concern which they can own. But given that, you know, I think there's a lot of potential in how do we think outside of this realm? How do we actually not seek to create revisionist narratives of space and time, but think about that which had already been established prior to the colonial project, which were already situated, nonlinear understandings, fluid understandings, different types of relationships with the world. And you know, I do think in a sense that certain types of artistic practices, you know, especially, you know, from persons such as yourself, are attempting to push that imagination forward into that realm. But I also think it gets trapped again in what Professor Raju is saying, and that resistance to the metaphysical itself, right? So that desire to encounter the aesthetic as an opening to that which is unknown, but then as soon as that opening is unfolded, having that opening subsumed back into the comfort of the logics themselves. So does that make sense to what I'm... And how do we negotiate that space when that pull is so strong? You know, sorry, I'll be quick with this. You know, and that pull and that relationship is so strong, even from the spectator and the creator, and you know, that pull, that desire for the different, the unknown, is always in a tense relationship with the comfort of the ceremony of that which we already know. And if that is the case, then how do we break that substantial cycle? Because of course it would force us into a contingency that we find no grounding. And that, you know, in a way, you know, this, you know, finding this grounding, you know, I do think of, you know, especially in a relationship with what Professor Raju was saying, you know, thank you for such an incredible intervention, by the way, and appreciating how even this problematic itself cannot be divorced from the cybernetic fantasy of thought, knowledge, and information, but more so the necessity for faith and the divine. And it makes me think of, you know, Sylvia Winter's intervention and thinking about, you know, as she says, the ceremony must be found, you know. And so when I think of your interventions together, it almost makes things make sense that we would put such faith in mathematics, that we would put such faith in symbolic unknowns, as you would say, because we've seen the failure of being able to put that faith within the divine in whatever form itself, right? And you know, we know that humanism crushed that Western idea. And so to think about this necessity of faith, and then what arrives is this intense amplification of computation, this amplification of mathematics having an importance in society, promising the same type of abstraction and metaphysical feelings that you would get from, say, a tree, right? We don't know where the tree came from. We just know it's there. And we know if we cut it, we can see how many rings it has inside, and we know it's going to arrive. And then here we have these sophisticated algorithmic processes that are arriving with this promise. And it's almost like it becomes the ceremony in which we need, and we need something to sort of carry us through into the future. And then at the same time, we're in a sort of cycle of this Fanonian neuroses, because we understand that it is control in itself, right? So we just like, we can live with it and we can't live without it. And in turn, it's just tearing us apart on the outside. And I've seen this process being sort of replicated either in some communities when I speak, and certain computer science communities, because they typically end with me with one statement that I usually have, which is quite provocative, and because they get really animated. You say that an algorithm is racist, or that Leibniz actually, the same person who's developing a concept of differential of a differential calculus is the same person that wanted to use that formula to colonize Egypt. You say that, and they just get tense, and it's like their world is being torn apart. And it usually ends by one statement of me feeling actually the pain that these individuals have, and then trying to help them understand that they are actually putting their body forward in defense of math. And it's a really, and I don't say that to be provocative, but I say that in a sense that if someone is to propose that this mathematical process is a colonial process, this mathematical process is inherently racist or inherently homophobic or inherently gendered, and to have someone participating in that space go into a place of defense, I think it's really striking to then say that to make it apparent that you are actually putting yourself forward in defense of a symbolic abstraction. And like Professor Raju and you were saying, in something that's a fantasy, it's a fiction, it's actually unknown. It can only be touched by the fantasy itself. So much so, and it's so powerful that when even the assertion that it could be doing damage to another human being becomes a personal offense in which one must then defend to the death almost. And that to me is a worrying type of intervention. And it goes back to what you're saying, Dr. Sunder, is thinking about, that terms of revision, because it seems to be replicating that same strength of prioritizing the ceremony of that which was already a fiction. As Professor Raju was saying, there is no 1 + 1 = 2. Yeah, I'm ready to put my body, my talent, my practice, my life forward in defense of that grounding. And what does that mean for us in the contemporary? Sorry, I think I've talked too much. I'm gonna sort of tone it down.
Thank you so much. Thank you really for your offerings and responses, and Ramon and Aarti. I guess would be great, Professor Raju, would you like to respond, or like to the also challenge of where we are able to situate the labor of decolonizing mathematics in this kind of categorical, almost like binarism of a form of practice, and a kind of question of education that you also were, I guess, like elaborating. What does it mean? I mean, where could we situate that labor of decolonizing those kind of infrastructures, unconscious, that we all kind of engage with and repeat without wanting, conditions and an unconscious that we do not wish to operate? And how to, I mean, I think I really appreciate, I think it's a question that we discuss also many times with our students, and it's a continuous also struggle regarding to open up, or what is that space between these categorical positions, or the positions that also modernity has produced in the first place, of a colonial matrix of the calculus, And that calculus that is like operational towards multiple and endlessly limitless infinities, I think, as you also explained this, or maybe to come back to the text that we have been reading, maybe the relation, or to break open the space between the straight line and the curved line in the question of the calculus that you have been elaborating, the compass box and the rope box. If I don't want to, I try to bridge. I hope this makes sense. Thank you, Dr. Amaro, Dr. Sunder, and it would be great to hear you back, because I think these are really important questions also for us in terms of practice.
Okay, let me answer the simplest question that you raised. Now, this is about cultural specificity, if you like, of mathematics, of geometry, whether you start with a straight line or with a curved line. Now, this is not something which is coming from nowhere. It is part of the indoctrination process that one goes through as a result of education. Every child is handed a compass box. And in that compass box, there is a ruler. But if you look at Egyptian geometry, or if you look at Indian geometry, it was based on the string. And a string is something flexible. So that string geometry starts by measuring a curved line. Now, if I want to define the length of a curved line, seemingly it is so simple to do with a string. Length of a I cannot do it in mathematics without bringing in rectifiable curves, without bringing in calculus, without bringing in all sorts of stuff, which doesn't really make sense. But it's such a simple process, and people have been doing it from before the straight line. So the straight line is a cultural imposition. And it is a bad cultural imposition because it depends upon the way geometry developed in Europe. They used it for navigation. And they did navigation using plane charts. And because they used plane charts, therefore they had to have, and they did straight line navigation and what is called plane navigation. They didn't do global navigation because they went only in a limited place, the Mediterranean Sea, and it's only when they started going out further that they had this problem of curved lines, or what are called loxodromes. You know, that if you go in one direction on the map, you don't go actually in one direction. You go in a curved line, a spiral. I think Escher has a number of things about loxodromes and how it was a big problem in 16th century navigation. So this is an issue, and this because of the particulars under which that particular thing developed, that way of doing geometry, because some idea that straight line is perfect. And Descartes will say, no, you can't compare straight lines and curved lines. Why not? It is so simple. You have a curved string, you straighten it, and you compare the two. But he has in mind some metaphysics of infinity. You seem, I mean, people are taught that that is the right way of doing it, which is not true. And there are so many other ways of doing it. It's so much simpler. Now, let me also come to this question of, all this technology, it seems to work. Actually, technology has a very short life. You build something which seems so grand, and then, within a matter of 3-4 years, it is junk. It is really amusing. If you think of the big computers that were built in the 30s, when we moved in, there was this huge computer which used to occupy whole building, and it had to be thrown out, which was because it was junk. I purchased software for a big system which was worth some $12 million, and it had to be junked. We could not use it because there was no space to keep that machine anywhere. It had to be just literally junked. So don't take technology so seriously. The rate at which it is junked is something quite amazing. What is high-tech today is junk tomorrow. All right, so let's understand that. And I think the fact that it works, it seems to work, doesn't mean that it cannot work better. All the things that I'm talking about or the calculus. It doesn't work. It didn't work for you. You didn't understand it. Why did you throw it away? Because you didn't understand it, because you didn't like it. So it didn't really work. It doesn't work for most of the people. Some people say it works. So you can't just go on the opinions of a few people in authority. The fact is that formal mathematics doesn't work for most people. Most people don't have the foggiest idea what it is. That's why I had to take so long to explain what it is. But you are told somehow it is great, you know, you are not using it anywhere. So it's not just cultural specificity, it is propaganda, number one. And number two, it is church hegemony. So you can't say that slavery was working. It was working, so I mean, the whole belt of America is built on slavery. So it works, and therefore retain it. Can we say that? You have to change it. Right? You can't say that genocide works, let's have more of it. After all, the whole land of America is taken from people who were indigenous people who were just all killed. You go anywhere in America, North America, South America, you can't find anybody. Maybe a little bit in Harvard, they come and dance and do something and so on, but you don't find them anywhere else. So you can't say that it works and therefore it can work much better. I think that's the issue that we are discussing. The mere fact that something worked in some way is not all right. So there is a hegemony, there's a system of hegemony under which I am struggling, and I would like to be free. I would most definitely like to be free. So the fact that it works for somebody doesn't work for me. So I will naturally resist it, just as you can't say, you know, slavery didn't work for the slaves. So they'll naturally resist it. So like that, the apartheid government worked for so long, supported by the United States. That doesn't mean that you should retain it. So I think that we are all ultimately, when you're talking about a certain final, I mean, if you final causes, if you like, I think it is important to talk about them, and maybe I'll explain why that is so in my system of ethics. So I think we are talking about a world which is better. And we can't say that it is, you know, just accept everything that works. I don't understand. Why don't you understand it? You are kept ignorant so that you would accept everything on authority. It's a deliberate strategy. Ignorance is a strategy to teach faith. Right? So I think we need to understand that it works. It does not work actually. And we need to be honest about what is it that works, which part of it works and which part of it does not work, and throw out the part which doesn't work, which is oppressive, which is the part which is oppressive. Because surely you understand 1 + 1 = 2 in terms of oranges, but you don't understand it in terms of formal mathematics. Now about this invisible part, let me come back to that. It's not merely that it's invisible. In my book on string geometry, textbook, I have used a specific example. It's an electron, for example, is invisible. I have no objection to something being invisible. Maybe you are visually challenged. But an electron, you pass it through a bubble chamber, you can get some indirect effects. But a point is pure metaphysics. It has no physical consequence whatsoever. And since it's pure metaphysics, it's pure fantasy. So now it is somebody else's fantasy. It's not my fantasy. I'm not interested in that fantasy. So why should I not change it and make things nice for ordinary people? Why do I want to listen to that authoritative fantasy from somebody from some Hilbert? I'm not interested in it. Because if I want to do anything, and the only way you did actual geometry in school was that you made dots which you could see. And you measured the distance between them. And that's the way you can do any art. You cannot just do it. I mean, maybe you can do like Magister Ludi. You are doing something, you know, which is complete metaphysics, which nobody understands. And everybody says it's so beautiful, so brilliant. It's, you know, it's like the, the beautiful gown that was made, invisible gown that was made for some king in that Iranian story. So I think that we need to be clear about this, that it's not merely cultural specific. I have no problem if you're talking about, let us say, Eskimos doing something. I have no problem with that. But here there is hegemony. And it is a resistance to that hegemony, which is very important. You can't pass it off as cultural specificity. There has always been hegemony. Church was hegemonic in Europe. You can't deny it. And if that hegemony was there, it was brutal hegemony. Look at the witch trials, look at the Inquisition, look at the genocide. All declared to be morally right. So when you have that kind of hegemony, that needs to be resisted, because the people who suffer are going to react, are going to resist it, right? It can't be just passed off as culturally specific. So I think that like language, for example, it's not like that. It's something different. So that's all that I would like to say. There are further questions. I'll go into that because I've already talked a lot. So if there are questions, I'll wait for them. Or if there are responses, I'll listen to them.
I think, quickly, my thoughts on education would be, as I think about, my engineering education, I think that the terms of ignorance, function very differently there. Because these epistemic logics are so pervasive, it necessitates already a certain type of ignorance in which we enter into this milieu of education. But I would advocate for, a bit more generosity and even understanding that as a product, as a final cause of this process is, our individuals entering into landscapes that seem to unfold infinite amounts of knowledge, but are based on fundamental ignorance in themselves. And I guess put plainly is, one has to encounter that which is contrary to they know to even identify their own ignorance, right? So I'm thinking about the novice engineering student who goes in knowing nothing about advanced level mathematics, nothing about advanced level design and all these proofs in physics, so on and so forth. They don't enter into an immediate relationship with its fiction because it's not taught. Right? I think this is what Professor Raju is saying. It's not taught. And I went through engineering school and it made no sense because nothing was contextualized. It was all repetition of learning. And I've told this anecdote often about, my first robotics controls class. I had severe imposter syndrome because from beginning to end for an entire academic year, my professor, she just wrote these long equations on the board. And we're talking about the equations that wrap around. We're not, we're not talking about, just the one line. Like these actually started to wrap and we're just memorizing these equations. And I was like, am I the only person? I have no idea what this means. I'm just memorizing it because I have to memorize it for the sake of the exam. Well, it turns out that the last day of the course, now mind you, we'd already been evaluated. We've had several quizzes, exams. We've absorbed these equations. And the last day of class, she reaches under her desk and she picks up a robotics control unit. Now, mind you, this control unit even itself is not attached to anything else. It's just a box. And she sets it on the desk and she says, this is what we've been talking about all year. And the entire room of about 100 people went, oh. And so this knowledge is completely decontextualized. We're talking about problem sets of looking at relative motion, and they're absurd problem sets. They're like, Bob is walking on a moving sidewalk this way, and there's a snowstorm, and Karen is walking the other way, and there's a windstorm. What's their relative velocity? And you just calculate. You just calculate. You take an aeronautics class without even seeing an airplane. Everything's 3D. I mean, everything's two-dimensional. You go to labs, of course, but everything's just absorbing equations. And there's never a moment where any creative process, any process outside of that, history, anything comes into the fore. There's never a class that says, actually, in today's terms, we would actually question Leibniz's viability. I mean, if Leibniz lived today, we would actually discard him as a conspiracy theorist. There's no way we would accept even the proofs that he proposed all across Western Europe. But to know that this is the process that is one of many that defines this absorption of knowledge without even an understanding of this individual, these contexts, these relationships, such as colonialism, all these things, it's no wonder that the engineer or even the statistician gets out into the field with no understanding, no concept of how this unfolds. And I'm curious about that relationship because I think we do take for granted that relationship of ignorance. I have a very close friend of mine does work at Google and we talk quite often. about the relationship between the engineers there. And the thing we actually talk about is when you say this is racist to an engineer at Google, they can't actually make the leap between that code on their screen and racism. It's like their head explodes because they haven't even been taught that that relationship exists. And they haven't even been in a purview of how that relationship unfolds. And I don't want to make excuses because there's no excuse for that. But I wanted to say that this relationship and the pervasiveness of this ignorance, it produces a type of milieu in itself. I mean, for me, when I graduated from engineering school, we were kept in the basement for that reason. And I'm not being dramatic, we literally were in the basement. I have worked at many places where your key card didn't even, wherever there was civilization, which is sociality, we weren't even allowed in that space. We couldn't even key your way in. And we were on different floors. There were people who communicated those languages up to those that are involved in different types of processes, marketing, whatever, who are supposedly able to understand the world. But we were in the basement, and we knew we were in the basement because we spoke a different language about the world. We knew we couldn't speak to, even if we were to put this, even if you put it in a capitalist lens, they knew that we couldn't actually speak to the customer because all we knew was symbols and calculation. And fast forward in a very short amount of time, those that were in the basement are now in the boardroom and has still never been taught the skills or the knowledges or the histories of these processes. And then we wonder why, when they're confronted with an issue such as colonialism and racism, that they're completely shocked. And I think that we need to actually think about all of our collective responsibility and how we actually position these processes, these individuals and these people. So for me, it's not just about, resisting hegemonic education. It's about understanding how actually that gap itself can be reduced in itself without sort of taking for granted that most of us, I mean, we know this from, Foucault and beyond, most of us aren't even aware that we're engaging in hegemonic processes themselves. And even when we are engaged with them in forums such as this, the question that always emerges is, what do we do? Because they've become so powerful, because they've become so pervasive. And I think that, that opportunity, and I think for me, that's why that opportunity of visibility and invisibility becomes implicitly important, because it is something for me that requires a significant perceptual shift in how we actually see the world, how we understand what we're participating in, and where the individual actually is in concert and in reflexivity to the world. And the last thing I'll say before I be quiet, and that's come from collective experiences interacting, with people I know as engineers. I have a friend who I meet every few years, works for an American defense company, and still, after decades, still does not see the problem when I say, hey, what are you working on? She says, I can't tell you the specifics, but it's a missile that burrows underground. And I tell her, what possible good use could that have for the planet? Like, I can't think of a single good use that a missile that's burrowing underground could have, humanitarian or otherwise. And it's taken decades just to even get her to see that what she participates in on a daily basis is a part of empire, which will have an effect on our future, because for her, she's just performing engineering. And of course, that's a very specific case, but I figure like a lot of my work wants to intervene in that space. And how do we produce perceptual shifts? And I think that's why the space, it's one of the reasons why I'm in the history of art, because I think for me, art practice, aesthetics, is a process in which allows the individual to open themselves up beyond those categorical imperatives, to understand the world in a way that might actually disrupt their sort of everyday and social practices. And of course, I'm valorizing, that kind of practice in itself. But I think, that intervention for me is the most important in terms of education itself.
Thanks very much, Ramon. I think it's going amazingly well. I just want to have any questions, please feel free either to unmute yourself if you feel comfortable or to put your question in the chat. And also I would like to invite Aarti if you would like to speak a bit more about this question of labor, actually, that is the question of human, which is related to the question of labor, in a sense that this transitory labor that we more often do not see under the guise of automation, right? Like in this, so I have to flag that I've been a programmer and engineer working in it made me realize that somehow the aesthetic talk into, be it contemporary art or theory for that sense, seems so far away from those who are theorized upon. So if we take the question of the IT workers, for example, or if we take the question of as in like on various platforms, people who bid for certain kind of jobs, and to actually do the human profiling of which kind of content is considered as racist or racialized, which kind of content is can be like damaging for cultural emotions. And so all of these aspects which rely much more on the idea of human, which is somehow considered as universal, and which we know from the practice of Sylvia Wynter, like 1492, a worldview, the article of Sylvia Wynter so profoundly talks about this division in human and sort of this Vesuvian realization of the human as universal. And I just wanted to open up these questions if you would like to talk about them, also in relation to the differential.
Thank you. Of course. I just want to backtrack a little bit because I remember you said there's actually this the case of chess. Professor Raju was also saying it's actually very interesting because it's one of the first automatons ever built. And what I think you mentioned, you said the term, you said the phrase "fantasy touches fantasy," and it sort of made me think about how that automaton initially was working. And the moment, so there was this box which had the figure of a Turk, because it was supposed to be a person who performed. It's the traveling performer in many ways, which is already a racialized category during the 1700s, 1800s. And it was supposed to be like an automated a box that would just play chess because they figured out how to compute chance, how to do this, that, and the other. And one of the things that happened that it sort of toured all around Europe and the US and all of that. And finally, they found out that there's actually a person sitting underneath in this box and sort of manipulating the coins. And what I think, what I find interesting, I think, is the moment that that broke, like the connection between, okay, how does this work? Oh my God, I don't know. This is great. It's fantastic. And suddenly you realize, no, it's not actually. There's this person sitting there and manipulating things. And this is moment where that break happens, where fantasy like sort of doesn't touch fantasy anymore. And you sort of lose interest in how a process takes place. And that it's a very interesting moment. Why was there so much, for instance, sudden disregard then for that object, just because you knew how it worked at some level? And there is, and I find that it's very similar to how we look at, say, something as simple as the or complex as the internet. So most of us don't know how it actually functions. I mean, we're very, very, very happy to not know because it's way too networked, it's way too modular, it's way too, there are multiple levels of points that interact in extremely difficult ways and extremely specific ways all over the world. The sun, the cubes, the tables, there's a whole lot of things. So I suppose the question arises when that arises is that the moment something is disambiguated, something is made clearer, and you sort of figure out, you sort of see the underlying processes. There's a there is an I don't know if it's almost like what you say, you don't know what to do with what you know now. So what do you do with this enormous piece of information that sort of challenges a very fundamental idea of how you believe that it works actually was, and what do you do with this? And I think fiction sort of plays an important role in this, in trying to sort of look at what do you do with what you have. So it's very, I just want to take just one last thing, which is, say for instance, say in the case of privacy, you have, suddenly you decide, okay, you know what, I have all my material, all my online avatars, this, that, and the other, I have all this material. What do you do with this material? I mean, the thing is, do we know what to do with, say, all these point clouds that make up our identities, make up our, how are we going to choose this? How are we going to choose that? I mean, all this predictive modeling. So I think that's where there's a very strong slippage in terms of seeing it, but also once you see it, what really do you do? And what you're like, if I was given all my information, online information, I wouldn't know what to do with it. Yeah, okay, great, good for you. Okay, so now what? I'd rather, I mean, it's easier at some level to get Facebook to use it because they know what they're doing, kind of thing. I mean, even though, I mean, it's not actually as simple, but it's, and that's the, so in terms of how, say, MTurk works or these platforms work, that's what you end up having are, say, counter platforms. Like, for instance, there's a space called Turkopticon, where what happens is you get a whole lot of information about how the system works. And it's made only for people who use the platform itself. So if you actually go to Turkopticon, you're not quite sure what this is. You're not quite sure what are these red lines, what are these blue lines, what is happening, who's saying what about who. And what is interesting is that in trying to sort of understand how these counter platforms or how these counter spaces work, it's almost like a double-edged sword. You need to know how a system works, but you also sort of need to know how multiple system works. And these things, I feel, are it's very difficult to sort of to have this macro and micro seesawing ability to interject and put yourself and bodily understand these things, as well as very abstractly understand these things. And I mean, I keep going back to fiction because it's I find it's one of the best ways to be able to draw these particular lines, and to maybe think about if the man in the box who's manipulating those coins, if we could see him and we could tell a story about it, and people can continue to be interested in the object despite and in spite of knowing exactly how it works, then I think there's a particular barrier that's already broken, and it's very, and I mean, I think that's worth reviving in that sense.
I mean, I agree with you. I think that's why, you know, this concept by Sylvia Wynter of the ceremony becomes so profound. And thinking about how, you know, as a cultural body, and this is a collective global body, how we've become so dependent upon this this fantasy, and of course I put no moral claim to this fantasy. People, if that's an attachment that we have, that's fine. And I put no claim to whether that fantasy should be there or not of the divine or whatever type of source that one believes in or attaches to. But what Winter's point is that it's the desire in lieu of exhausting the point of trying to mimic or touch or understand that divinity. In lieu of that is the tendency to disregard it. And maybe, as you're saying, it might be connected to, the Wizard of Oz, the curtain opens and you see the person, so we have this equal desire to understand that some type of divinity might incorporate itself into the milieu, but then once you see a type of evidence of it, or what you believe might be an evidence of it, then we retract and we want to go back to the illusion, or we just completely lose interest. And Winter, of course, is saying that was the function and the failure of the humanist project, is to then position, in place of the divine, which could then not be touched, replacing that, of course, as the white heterosexual European male. And then in lieu of its failure to live up to that fantasy, the dissolution of that body, and now this sort of chaos as everyone searches for a new type of ceremony. But it comes with this caveat, as you're saying, is because this caveat is dependent upon the illusion itself not breaking, the illusion itself being placed intact. And we can only understand ourselves in relationship to this fantasy of what the world might be. And at the same time, we want the ceremony of being able to dedicate ourselves, to this type of fantasy. And, for me, especially dealing in computation, it becomes a point that's quite, for me, it's a point of resistance. I haven't seen that so much in some colleagues and some, in some forums that I've discussed it in, because and maybe, as I said, maybe it's too much of a pragmatic approach, but, during my research, it forced me to actually look at what an algorithm actually, not what an algorithm is, how it functions, which forces me to then look at the mathematics that build these algorithms, which then forces me to look at the history of those mathematics. And I've gone so far down the curtain and seen so many processes of a fiction become materialized that it completely demystified machine learning to me. It just completely demystified it. And so I have a hard time believing that these large entities that are perpetuating these things are as dangerous as they present themselves to be. It's almost like, going through this process of releasing the curtain and you realize the wizard is just, it's just a man. It's just someone that's there. It doesn't mitigate the damage that is being done, but it does articulate a type of power that the colonial process has spent years in convincing peoples that they don't have, right? And I think that part of fantasy and imagination is that which we already contain within our way of living. And by breaking that illusion, it also comes with a certain type of potential, right? So I think, in using this sort of antidote you're saying is like, for me, the individual that's losing interest by seeing the person manipulate the chess pieces, for me, I see that as an individual psychosocial process, because the individual is then faced with two acts of thought. One is the act of thought of saying that's an illusion of something which I thought I couldn't achieve, and therefore my fantasy is broken. But on the same side of that coin is another act of thought, which is more affirmative in saying that which I impose as being outside of myself and impossible, I now see a place of possibility. So basically, I can be the chess master. I just got to recruit someone to be under the board for me. Right? And I think, and so when I think about the algorithmic, when I think about these powerful entities, I think of them as individual bodies who've already recognized that they can play puppet master, where the rest of us have not recognized yet that we can use the same tools to play puppet master as well. But as long as we stay to that ceremony and that illusion, we see ourselves as outside of that process. And perhaps, as you're saying, there's a certain comfort in being that process, because what happens if I hand over the mathematics to you? What happens? What are you going to do with it? And then you all of a sudden have the responsibility. You have to question your position and place in the world and have everything that's unfolding with that. And I think that place is a very contentious place that many of us are not willing to, to enter. And there's some of us who've already, entered that space, but we tend to see them as deviants or heroes or something that's outside, as opposed to something that's already inside of our natural resistance, our natural capacity to resist, these types of tools. And I hope that makes sense. Yeah. And I think a lot of my affirmative stance with this comes from the fact that I really believe in hegemonic incompetence. I take a lot of self-power in that. I don't need any more proof. We get proof every day. We have proof right now. We have tech companies that have disposable income larger than small nations, and they couldn't even provide a Zoom link for this meeting. I'm not scared of these folks. The email barely works. Think about it. The capacity of what has been presented to us as power is so incompetent, is so unaware of itself, is so, even in its best attempts, is so deficient at understanding how real social processes work, just as deficient as understanding how real numbers work. There's such a deficit that all they have to rely on is the illusion of superiority in itself. And there's nothing more powerful than an individual walking in the space of assumed superiority with an affirmative personal stance that they are at equal or also engaged in that process. And then it all crumbles.
Thank you, Dr. Amaro, for this powerful and also motivating statement, really. I think we have, it's almost 3:30, but if you agree, we would like to extend the session for another 15 minutes. It would be great if you could stay on board. If there are no other questions right now from the audience, I would have one more question, particularly to Professor Raju, but also everyone feel free to shortly answer to this. I would like to bring back the title of our session, Decolonizing Socialism. And Professor Raju, also you spoke about how you think socialism also as an alternative approach and value system towards offering towards mathematics. And I'd be curious what you think about what then, I mean, of course, if you take, for example, the Soviet development of mathematics, there are great differences between the mathematics of Stalinist time and of the Khrushchev time. And I myself, am urban historian working in cybernetic urbanism, and that developed in these days. So there were also like very interesting alternative perspectives and values coming in. But nonetheless, there's also very, this, as you describe, hegemonic Western formal mathematics were also very present. And they were also used to increase power. And they were also taught to, in many other places of the world, like from the Soviet Union. So I was just curious what you think about this application of Soviet mathematics. I hand over to you, Professor Raju.
I didn't get your last question, last statement. Application of what mathematics?
Of the formal mathematics. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So I think that you can find some application of formal mathematics. For example, even number theory. You could find it in cryptography. Or you can take the formal mathematics, the probability theory of Kolmogorov. You can use it to build, for example, you have the Chapman-Kolmogorov equations for Markov process. And Markov process are neural networks. They are what are used in machine learning programs and so on. But you're never actually going to use the formal aspects of them. That is basically, I think, the point that I made. The formalism is pure metaphysics, which is talked about but never used, cannot be used. So the question is, why do we need this constant hypocrisy of talking formalism but doing things differently? And I think that is basically what I suggested, that because we talk formalism, that seems to undermine socialism in a very subtle way of undermining the basic value system, because formalism is dependent on authority. And it is dependent on Western authority. See, it's not just, real numbers. You name one system, one mathematical system where the axioms came from the non-West. And you can have a variety of axioms. What is important about one particular axiom? Why not do things in another way? So there is this hegemony of subordination to authority that formal mathematics teaches. And that is very bad for the socialist value system. I think that is why there was another point that I want, 2-3 points I wanted to come back to. One point that Aarti was making about, that Turkish, that chess playing machine. Now, I gifted my grandson a box of magic tricks. And the first lesson that he learned, which my son also learned when he tried to learn magic, was that don't reveal the magic, because if you reveal it, it goes away. It's as simple as that. But that is in the case of magic, where it is really quite a trivial sort of trick. Now, that is not the same thing that happens with the chess playing machine. Now, what the chess playing machine is doing, it used to be very bad 30 years ago. It used to be, or maybe even if you go further back, 50 years ago, these chess playing machines used to be extremely bad. I used to laugh at it. They can so easily beat it because if it is thinking at level 3, it goes that far and it doesn't think of the disaster waiting at level 4. It cannot conceptualize that because it just does that calculation. But now 2 things have happened. And one is that the capacity of the machine to be able to calculate has enormously increased. And the second thing is, of course, is machine learning programs, that it understands also strategy, which is very hard to teach, because this was the basic point, that the machine can't learn strategy. And I think that the issue here is not that it is very difficult. The issue is how such a stupid algorithm, such a very simple algorithm, which can go on being used, can generate so much power. Something as simple as linear regression. We used to laugh at people who did regression. And that is one of the big things in machine learning these days. So I think that the magic doesn't go away, but the magic that we are really talking about is the inclusion of creativity in science and the inclusion of creativity in technology. That has not been done, and that is the point I wanted to make when I talked of quantum computing. That you'll be forced to include it because it will happen. And when that happens, you don't know what is going to, which way the world is going to run. Because you're really going to end up creating a superhuman species. It would make human beings quite irrelevant. And I think the third point that I wanted to address was this issue of the IT labor force. I think that one of the things that one understands is you manage an IT labor force, that first of all, you make sure that nobody has the big picture. I think all these companies do that. They make sure that you work only on one module. One little more module. It's like Charlie Chaplin, tightening one screw in modern times. He keeps doing that. That's all that he does. He doesn't, he's totally alienated. He doesn't have anything about what is the big picture. He's not designing it. Now I sell a program which I made the whole thing from scratch. And I did the whole thing. And now the problem is I have lost part of the source code. I can't reconstruct it. It's still selling. So that becomes a different cup of tea completely from, what kind of work was done by an individual who has the whole picture, and somebody who has only a very fragmented part of what is happening. You do one module and you don't know about anything else, and it is very tightly guarded. So I think that this fragmented view is very problematic. It was already very problematic. Now, when you allow the machine to learn, which can go obviously far beyond its programming, you don't know what exactly it is learning, what it is doing. And it can learn something right, it can learn something wrong. And if the person who's programming it doesn't have a clear idea of what all things can happen, then that is dangerous. And I think the other point, one of the points that Aarti was making, that, you don't care what Facebook is doing. Facebook is making a puppet out of you. The fact is that they are able to crunch that big data. They are able to predict your actions. Not just Facebook, Amazon, everybody is doing it. And the fact that they are able to watch, and they are not doing it in an individual level. A human mind can't grasp so much of detail. The machine is doing that big data analysis. And it is able to predict, well, with a fair degree of certainty, what you are going to do next, which book you are going to buy, which site you are going to visit, and so on and so forth. And so instead of the machine being something in your hands, you have become a puppet, and then you are told you buy this, and you buy this, and we'll show you this advertisement, and so on and so forth. And that is how they are making their fortunes. I mean, it may be all fairly silly, but I think it is there. And the IT labor force, you can't really blame that. They do, I mean, some of them, I know the smarter ones who left Google, but there are very few people like that, because they value their, they start off at $100,000, and they are very happy to pocket that amount and not ask questions. So I think that it is not exactly what you would call a labor force in the sense in which Marx used that term for factory labor, but it is somewhat like that. If you go to Bangalore and see the mass production that is done in these IT camps, it is pretty horrible, it is pretty dehumanizing, and it is pretty alienating, but in a slightly different kind of a way. And I think that somebody should really conceptualize that. I think it has not been adequately conceptualized. So I think that's what I would like to say. Thank you.
I'm laughing severely here because in this idea of labor fragmentation, because even as a student I spent most of my time in automotive design and quality, and even as a student I was actually afraid to drive or fly for many years because I could not figure out why you don't turn the key and the thing just blows up, because I couldn't find a single person who had an overview of how all these things came together. And I would go and meet people just to be, a curiosity. And once I went inside a very dark lab, and I mean, it was pitch black and people were on their design screens, and I stopped and just chatted with someone, and he designed door locks. And this was his 10th year designing door locks. And one door lock looked the same as another door lock. And and he just in this process. And there was another moment where I went into this kind of office space, and it was all filled by glass, and you had to key your way into different hallways. And I asked the person, how long have you been working here? And he says 15 years. And I said, well, those people you see, you look through the glass, you see. I said, what does that team do? And he says, I don't know. And it's so, it's almost, the Fordian dream of discretization is so pervasive, and I think I agree with you. That's part of the problem. So then when these individuals, when the guy designing the door lock, and the algorithmic equivalent of that, then gets encountered with discourse that says, this is producing fake news, they have no relationship. They have zero relationship to how actually what they've done on a daily basis gets articulated into mass information or any of these things. And the people that hold that general overview are just obscure. They're unknown. yet we are asking those that are on the ground coding and typing these things to be the ones that are accountable. And I'm not sure if that's the right direction. And I think that's part of that fantasy, is that you have this engineer in this with, you know, who has access to Facebook's millions and millions of lines of code and are actively, you know, and are actively looking at the screen and saying, I'll change this piece of code and that will get rid of racism, or that will get rid of the mimicry of homophobia or fascism or something like that. And you're right, they don't have an overview of that. They don't even have an understanding of that. And then when they're given an understanding of that, it's a task-based understanding, such as figure out a process to quantify discrimination. Like, how do you quantify fear? How do you quantify racial implication? How do you quantify the feeling of harassment? So it becomes an impossible task in itself, and in a way just becomes a fictive illusion that becomes a spectacle then to present back to us as something that is actively working on, when inside, internally, it has no more of a clue how to solve these social issues than we do outside of the algorithm.
Actually, interestingly, on Amazon a couple of years ago tried to, they said that they want to eliminate child labor from the production of Alexa. And it took them 5 years to determine that they basically couldn't figure out what the process was, what the actual workflow was, where the stuff was coming from, who was making it, which mine, which country. They couldn't figure it out. It took them 5 years to do it. And finally, all they could do was to say that this particular batch of products do not have child labor involved with it. And they could only do it for one batch. And so what you're saying, I mean, 100%, I mean, the level of to which it is being segregated and sort of atomized is in a scale which is, I mean, it's far bigger than, I think, it's far bigger than what we maybe think. Even, definitely.
Yeah, that's why we need socialism. And for socialism to work, that's why we need to decolonize it.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't want to, you know, reduce the complexity and the, you know, the skill that it takes to engage in these processes, because these are highly intelligent people who are doing very skillful things. Some of them believe they're doing great things, others don't care, others are in different types of spaces. But I think as long as those that want to intervene in that space continue to think of these entities and the individuals within them as having more hegemonic power than they do, I think it will limit the possibility of resistance itself, right? Because there are very few people at Facebook that even know what the hell is going on at Facebook. And so, you know, and how to intervene in that space, you know, it's old David and Goliath type of, you know, Judeo-Christian tale, you know, of I think buying into this ceremony that they actually have more power than they do is equally as dangerous in our, you know, in our way to resist it. You know, because to me, there's an affirmative value in that type of, you know, I'm calling this, you know, this hegemonic incompetence. There's a certain value to it. You know, that is, and it's a value that many of us already participate in. You know, this is what Fanon had really warned us about in an affirmative potential with colonialism, is that there's a value in opening the curtain to see the epistemic processes and then riding that epistemic line as a form of resistance. I mean, that's how the Algerians were able to transfer arms, right? Because they knew what the colonial structures of gender were. And so they transferred arms to the women because the perception at the time, which still exists today, is that a woman wouldn't possibly have a rifle or a machine gun. So they use that fact to actually transfer. You know, of course, you have to think about the ethics of a gender line there. I think that's more complicated to think about, but it reduces that epistemic claim. You know, Fanon said the same thing about the radio and technology. You know, because the initial response from the FLN in Algeria was, as France was pumping propaganda into Algiers, the initial response was to turn it off, because this powerful country is pumping in propaganda. And then Fanon had to remind them that they can only pump this propaganda through rudimentary tools, which is a radio wave on a wire and poles. And this radio wave is bidirectional, which means if it can come from France, it can also come from Algeria. So turn the radio back on. Don't just turn the radio back on, start your own radio station and pump it back into France. And that's what they did, a sort of counter propaganda back into France. So when I think about the algorithmic, I think that's why I resist in thinking about it as a hegemonic tool. I want to see it as a tool that is as fragile as its design. And then because of its fragility, just like an infrastructure, right? The first thing we want to do if we want to resist infrastructure is to find the weakness in the infrastructure. And once we find that weakness in the infrastructure, that is what can be exploited, both for affirmative and so what, and that type of gain. The benefit about what we have right now, that's different than sort of epistemic colonial times. The benefit is the same companies that are pushing this type of algorithmic governance are the same companies that are trying to teach us how it works. Literally, they want you to learn how it works. Of course, their hope is that they can subsume you there, but once you learn it, you actually learn how to beat it. Because they haven't developed any new types of mathematics. They haven't developed any nonlinear processes that outside of their own capitalist aims. They haven't reached a point of contingency with it that would open up possibility, because it doesn't fit within their epistemic model. But the tools to do so are the same exact tools. And we know this from MIT. I mean, even MIT runs free courses on machine learning, right? It's not easy, and it's boring. I think it's boring. It's not easy, but it's not like the tools aren't there. And it's not like we don't have access to the tools. And once we actually see access to the tools, it will become apparent. And I think that hopefully many of us will have the same question that I had many years ago, it's a surprise that Facebook actually functions. It's a surprise that they turned the key and it's there. Because it's so discretized and it depends on the fragility. And the only thing recognizing that fragility has been folks who have said, its fallibility with being racist and being homophobic, so on and so forth. And I think that it's not just about pushing that narrative and then waiting for them to respond to that narrative. I think it's more of a matter for those who want to intervene in that space to push them to the limits of the mathematics in which they praise, and let the mathematics fall and crumble on themselves, because they will, because they're based on a fiction to begin with. And the more we push them into that fiction, they will, just as infrastructure, fold and fall onto themselves, which I think is what we're saying right now, which is why you can't, after all this work, we barely can get on a Zoom call. It's folding on itself.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Ramon, Aarti, Professor Raju. So much to think with and to study, to reveal and to turn against itself. I think it really poses the question of labor and exhaustion, in terms also of the amount of work that needs to be done, both to study the hegemony and to take its tools to turn it against itself. But this is also something that has been discussed and conceptualized for centuries since colonialism existed, and also anti-colonial struggles operated exactly on those kind of tactics and practices of resistance. Thank you so much. I think we are quite exceeded in time, and we are still able to take questions. I mean, I don't want to just we should not just take it off. Also, very importantly, Ghalas, Phoebe, Who is still there? Also from the students, we are already a bit delayed. Lorelei, Balam, Basile, who, Camille is there? There is Balam. Good, yes, please switch your cameras on. That's so lovely to see you. Sarah, hello, good to see everyone with a lot of patience, endurance and commitment already since this morning. And I know it is impossible to present like this is the result. It's rather more, would you mind please to share with us how has been your process and what have you detected? What have you rehearsed? What has been important from your perspective for this conversation to share, and also as a way, I think, to reflect as a kind of a wrapping up with us together. Ghalas, I hand over to you, please. Thank you.
The presentation and the conversation. So we were both physically here and online trying to find ways to transcribe and archive this moment. The workshop earlier this morning addressed a personal speech to text transcription practice. So with questions about the haunting presence of the speaking body in a transcript as a question, as a disappearance actually, and how here the exercise was a bit different since there was this digital body between us. So along with the participating students, Phoebe, Basile, Michael, Balam, and Sarah, we tried to point out and signal ways experimented collectively with the digital characteristic of the Zoom platform as a focal point. So some of us were more interested in the sound glitches, the frozen screen, especially the unintentional interruptions that we had from the public, for example, or the lagging. And all of this are gonna be translated into symbols that the students will put in place in a code. Some others reverted to old school pen and paper tools to record or draw physical postures, for example, through color palettes were also symbols. And another proposition was to use automated Google voice-to-text software translation to translate into one of the students' first language, Russian, and also look at the approximations of the translation and maybe point them out with emojis, the mistakes, the misinterpretations. So these are all tests we went through today, and I think we will need to have a moment to debrief with the students and some point to bring you or augment this archive, this audiovisual recording with our propositions later on in the week, maybe, hopefully. But thank you, everyone. It was very rich. I don't know if any one of the students, I see Phoebe is sharing things.
Yeah, hi. I just shared my transcript because I had it digitally, so you can have a look and see if you understand.
Yes, so very curious to follow up also with, of course, the students. It's great to see. Thank you, Ghalas.
All right, I shall fill the silence briefly to say I have to go off to a lecture. I wish you all well. Thank you so much for this intervention. And I hope to see you all again soon. Okay.
Thank you, Ramon. Thank you for your time. I know you shifted something really, you shifted your agenda around, and thank you so much for joining us and for grooving in and being very so generous, sharing your thoughts. Thank you, Ramon.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
I think we close the meeting now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.